Very good afternoon to one and all. I am Swarnam, Assistant Professor of MBA Department of SNS College of Technology. In today's session, we are going to discuss on the working capital concepts and the types of the working capital. Before getting into the session, we shall discuss we shall get into the recap of the session. In the previous class, we have been discussed on the dividend. So, obviously a dividend, a part of earnings which is being distributed to the shareholders is what called as a dividend, and dividend policy. So, all the company will not have a same type of dividend policy. Some company will have a liberal dividend policy, some company will have a strict dividend policies also. So, based on their reserve and based on their expansion and the growth strategy, the company's dividend policy will always differ. So, in the previous class we have seen the factors which has been determining the dividend policies of a company, and in today's session we are going to see the components of the working capital. So, when we tell about the components of the working capital, we can classify the components into current assets and current liability. Current assets, these are the assets which can be easily converted into cash not exceeding 1 year, that is what current assets. So, when we tell about the current assets, the liquidity position of that asset would be always stronger. So, cash, inventories, bank, prepaid expenses, all these categories it will come under the current assets. Current liabilities, these are the liabilities which has been intended to pay within a year. So, that is what called as a current liability. Short term liability which is to be paid within a particular course of business. Example for current liability: loans, short term borrowings, creditors. So, when we tell about the components, we can classify the components into two. One is current asset and another one is a current liability. So, we will see the classification of the working capital. So, classification of the working capital, we can classify the working capital under two categories. One is based on the concept, the another one is based on the time. So, based on the concept, one thing is called as a gross working capital, the other one is a net working capital. Gross working capital means the total of the current asset is what called as a gross working capital. Example, if I am having a cash, bank, inventories. So, if I have a cash of 10,000, if I have a bank balance of 20,000, if I have an inventory for 30,000, totally the current asset is 60,000. So, gross working capital, it deals with the total current asset. So, total of the current asset is what called as a gross working capital. Net working capital in the sense current assets minus current liabilities is what called as a net working capital. In the previous example, I have told I am having a current asset of 60,000. Similarly, if I have a liability for 20,000, so my net working capital is 60,000 minus 20,000, so that is 40,000. So, that is what called as a net working capital. In gross working capital, you will not compare your asset with your liability. In case of your net working capital, you will compare your current assets with the current liability, and the deduction of the asset with the current liability is what called as a net working capital. Then on basis of the time, permanent working capital and variable working capital. Permanent working capital, that is a minimum required capital which is to be maintained by the company is what called as a permanent working capital. So, all the company, they should have a minimum amount of working capital inside their company. If in case if they are not having a minimum amount of working capital, they cannot run the day to day activity of their business. Example, if my company is a manufacturing concern, I supposed to maintain minimum of 1 lakh rupees as a permanent working capital. I should have 1 lakh with me as a reserve, and always I should maintain 1 lakh to meet out the expenses. in case if I have a shortage in the amount, if I am not maintaining the permanent working capital, I cannot fulfill the commitments, I cannot take care of the regular activities. Example, I cannot purchase the raw material, or I cannot pay the salary to the employees on time. So, or I cannot pay the electricity bill or telephone charges, whatever it might be. So, the company always it should have a permanent working capital, minimum working capital which is to be required by the business is what called as a permanent working capital. Regularly they should maintain and they should keep it as a reserve in order to meet out the regular expenses which is to be incurred by the company. And variable working capital in the sense which is over or above the permanent working capital is what called as a variable working capital. Example, at the time of when the demand is peak, obviously we supposed to produce more amount of products. So, if the demand is high, if your product is a seasonal product, if your demand of the product is very huge in the particular month, you have to go for an massive production during those months. So, by that time you should have an additional working capital, that is what called as a variable working capital. So, variable working capital, it will always be more than the permanent working capital which is over or above the permanent working capital. So, we have seen the classification on the basis of the concept and basis of the time. So, hope you would have been understood with the concept of a working capital and also the types of the working capital. So, now it is the time for assessment. So, can you give the formula for computing the net working capital? Yes. So, the net working capital in the sense current asset minus current liability is what called as a net working capital. So, thank you for listening to the session. Hope you would have been understood with the working capital concepts and the types of the working capital. Thank you. Thank you for listening.